Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to today's little chat to celebrate Homebirth Awareness Week. My name is Kristyn and I'm a volunteer for Homebirth New South Wales. And today we're going to be talking to Athena Hammond from the Birth Council. I'm just going to read out a little bit of a blurb to get started. First of all, I just wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land which I'm currently on, the Darug and Gundungurra people. And just to let you all know that the session will be recorded. So we are celebrating Homebirth Awareness Week this week, and we're really excited to be bringing you a couple of incredible virtual events for all of you to follow. To give you insights into various aspects for planning your upcoming birth and motherhood journey. You can see all of the other events we have planned on our our website, homebirthnewsouthwales.org.au, and click on events. Homebirth New South Wales is a not-for-profit organisation run by committed, passionate volunteers who are dedicated to educating and supporting women who choose to give birth at home. Our mission is to enable improved accessibility and affordability to home birth services in New South Wales and Australia-wide for all families that want it. Homebirth New South Wales provides families information and support in their pregnancy and birth journey, including linking women to an incredible list of home birth midwives and other services, including doulas and birth photographers who support home birthing families all the time. Homebirth Awareness Week is an international event where we aim to shine a light on the safety and the incredible benefits obtained by birthing at home, and to support those who are seeking home birth by welcoming them into our local and statewide communities. Home birth is a very safe option for low-risk women who want to have a more natural birth and reduce the risk of birth interventions. Birthing at home with a midwife in attendance is as safe as birthing in a hospital for mother and baby, but also reduces maternal morbidity. Home birth reduces the chances of severe perineal tearing, cesarean section, instrumental birth, inductions and epidural use, and increases the likelihood of a physiological vaginal birth. Typically, while providing you with the safety and comfort of your own home and a known skilled care provider. As you'll see in the events of this week, there are many positives to birthing at home. So hopefully these sessions will provide more information for home birthing families and those interested in home birth. I'll remind you all at the end of the session as well, don't forget we have a really awesome raffle going at the moment. You can win a birth photography package, doula training, lactation consultants, lots of awesome stuff. And also, just by being here today, you can get access to a $50 discount voucher from Active Truth, our sponsor for Homebirth Awareness Week events. So at the end of the session, I will show you a little screenshot of a QR code that you can take a scan on your phone, and that will give you the discount. Okay, so just a little bit of a disclaimer. Today, we will be discussing some topics like birth trauma, disappointment in birth, hospital transfers, and other topics that you might find a little bit upsetting. So please use your own discretion as to whether now is the best time for you to be joining in this conversation. And when you are posting in the chat, just be mindful of that as well and the other people who are watching. So we won't be discussing things such as home birth safety, because we feel that's been well established and that's not really the focus of today's conversation. And also we don't want it to be a forum for sharing traumatic stories or things like that, just because there are others on the call. So, and it's also being a virtual event where everybody's muted. It's not easy for us to then give those people the help and assistance that they might need. So just be mindful when you're putting things in the chat. Feel free to ask questions at any point, and we'll either answer them as we go or we'll wait until the end. We're just going to go with the flow. So I'm going to go over to Athena now and ask her to introduce herself and tell us a little bit about what she does.
I might unmute myself. That will make things easier. Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for coming to chat with us today. And thanks to Kristyn for inviting me to come and be part of this conversation. Yeah, so in terms of what I do, I'm a midwife and I'm also a counsellor. And what I do is try and work kind of in the space between those two things. I guess one of the things I noticed really quickly as a midwifery student quite some time ago was that women really needed someone to talk to. They weren't really that interested in having people take their blood pressure. They were more interested in making a connection and feeling heard and supported. And I guess all the way back then, that was when I started thinking that we had a bit of a gap in between these two processes. And as I have worked more through the maternity care settings, talked to more women, talked to more midwives, talked to more doulas. So I was a doula for a long time before I became a midwife. It just became more and more apparent to me that we have a huge gap in the system. We have perinatal mental health services, which do a great job for women who are having really acute mental health issues and need a really particular type of care. But we don't actually have anything that sits kind of in the space around that for women who are feeling like they've had an experience that they require some support with, but they don't really fit into or kind of meet the criteria for someone who would be able to access perinatal mental health services. So that's kind of how I've ended up in this space. And what I do at the moment is I work in private practice, both as a home birth midwife. I work with Jo Hunter, whom some of you may know either in person or by reputation, as second midwife. And then I have my own counselling practice where I see women, partners, doulas and midwives.
Thank you so much. I'm really honoured to have you here talking to us because I know I've heard of you by reputation as well. Out to you, and I think it's a really important topic to discuss. And we kind of struggled a little bit with how we were going to frame this conversation when we were coming up with ideas for this week's events, because nobody likes to really talk about or even think about when things might not go according to plan. But the reality is that sometimes it happens, and I think it's important to talk about just so that, we want everybody to have an informed, full picture before they go in to their birth experience. So I'd like to start, I think, by thinking about the different reasons why women might choose home birth and how their preparation for the birth might be different. So say you've got somebody who this is their first pregnancy and they're planning a home birth, as opposed to somebody who has had births before in the hospital system that may have been traumatic or even just disappointing. So how would their preparation differ?
From my perspective?
Yeah, like what would you recommend, particularly for those women who have had a previous traumatic experience?
Okay, so I guess in some ways it's a tricky question to answer. In the space where I sit, I feel like context is everything. And for each individual woman and her partner, if she has one, and or their support people, you know, everyone brings kind of their own whole self and their whole history into the process of preparing for birth. And so a lot of that is going to be predicated on your, as you point out, Kristyn, your previous experiences. If women have had experiences in the past, either around birth or actually in other aspects of their lives, so it might not even be that they've had, in the kind of trauma language, they often talk about big T trauma and little t trauma. So it might not even be that you've had a kind of big T trauma around a previous birth, but you may have other things in your life. You might have a complex medical history. You might have had some other things that have occurred in your relationship or in your family or in your upbringing that kind of accumulate to bring you to a place where, when you're preparing for birth and moving into a space of really intense, basically intense vulnerability, that those things start to surface or kind of rise up. And so in terms of preparation, I guess from my perspective, I'm a really big proponent of what I just call clearing the way, which is thinking about just trying to make space. And whether you've had a previous sort of big T trauma or not, most of us come into the space of preparing for birth with, you know, everything else that's happened to us along the way, all of our vulnerabilities, all of our quirks, all of our previous experiences. And I guess when we think about it from a nervous system perspective, and with what we understand now about the way that the body and the nervous system store those experiences, and even in terms of memory, so we have two different types of memory, explicit and implicit memory. We don't always store those experiences in our explicit memory, they're in our implicit memory, which means that they're in there, but they don't sit in our kind of conscious mind. They're not accessible by our sort of thinking brain. But our body knows that all of that is there, and our nervous system stores all of that for us in an energetic sense. So I guess in some ways, I think regardless of where you're coming from, regardless of what your previous experience is, it's kind of like you want to make some space in your nervous system. Because for everybody, labour and birth are going to ask a lot of you. Yeah, you're going to experience a really heightened period of time where you're going to be dealing with a lot of sensation and a lot of emotion. And so the more space we can make in your nervous system, the more kind of fluidity and capacity you're going to have when you step into that space, rather than coming in where everything's already up to here. And actually you're going to tip over really easily into overwhelm, or what we would call from a nervous system perspective, escalation.
Yeah, so it sounds like regardless, you know, of whether it's your first birth or your second, third or fourth, whether you've had previous negative experience or not, some things might come up, and you may not even be able to, you know, consciously think of them, but because your body goes into this sort of primal brain space when you're in labor, you may be surprised about what comes up. And yeah, I guess, you know, pregnancy is a good time to clear the way, like, as you say, you know, you're nesting your house, you're nesting your brain as well,
Yes.
getting ready for birth. Yeah, because it's a massive transformation. And I feel like when I was pregnant the first time, people just loved to come and tell me all their horror stories about birth. And I was really good at blocking them out, because I was adamant that none of those things were going to happen to me. I'm in control of this. I've chosen this care provider for a reason. You know, everything's going to be amazing. I did all the, you know, the calm birth and the birth visualizations, and I was really, really fixated on this peaceful, calm water birth at home. And so my first birth experience ended in a transfer to hospital at 37 weeks pregnant, and I had a very rare medical complication. My appendix ruptured when I was heavily pregnant, so no one could have seen that coming. I mean, the reality is you just can't plan for everything. But I feel like a big part of my, I'm the type of person who likes to be in control and know what's coming around the corner. And because I was very fixated on this one particular, I was very rigid in my plans, I guess. And I feel like that was a part of my, that led to a big part of the disappointment for me, is that I had no control. And even though my cesarean was medically necessary, and I fully accept that, I still beat myself up a little bit afterwards because I didn't entertain the thought of a transfer to hospital. I went quite the other way and deliberately avoided thinking about it because I thought I might somehow jinx myself, which is a fairly common thing that I sort of came across in the positive birth communities and home birth community, is this concept of manifesting your birth. And while I do believe, there is a big part, that is very valid, I also think that it's important to be a little bit flexible with your, birth plans or birth map, whatever you want to call it. And yeah, I mean, it depends, like you said, context is everything. It depends on the person, what's important to them. So for me, it was control and being aware of what was happening. So I guess that is a good thing to reflect on in pregnancy. Perhaps what type of person am I? What's important to me? What experience, or how do I want to feel at the end? Because the truth is, like, you can have a really positive hospital transfer experience, but I do think that takes a lot of planning as well. You need to be prepared, right?
Yeah, look, I think you've touched on a whole range of really interesting things there, Kristyn, and I agree with you, and I also hear that, and I imagine many of the other people on the call will have also encountered or heard that, really quite strong discourse, particularly around home birth, interestingly, about this sense that, it's part of our job as the childbearing woman. Another responsibility that we have is to manifest what is going to occur at the birth, and that, there is some hesitation to engage with thinking about or giving kind of space and energy to the idea that maybe things might go, that there might be more than one possibility that could unfold.
Yeah.
And I guess what I find challenging for me personally in that kind of discourse is this idea that when we think about what we know about us as humans and how we respond, and what we know about what is important to women in order to minimize their feelings of trauma and distress around birth, actually, for my money, I kind of think the other way about it. I think it's really important for us to accept that there are multiple possibilities, and that we give ourselves the opportunity almost to rehearse what it would be like if any one of those multiple possibilities occurred. That doesn't necessarily mean that we have to give all of our time and energy to it, but in that space where we start to work with those ideas of what might happen, what it does is it opens up the opportunity for us to think about, how do I want to feel if that happens? Okay,
Yeah.
if we need to transfer, what do I want it to feel like? What kind of experience do I want to have of that? What do I know about myself? You've identified that you're someone for whom control is very important. I hear that from a lot of women that I work with. And so having that time of self-reflection to go, yeah, you know what, it is really important for me to feel in control. If something happens that we haven't thought about, what will that be like for me? And most importantly, what will I need from the people around me in that circumstance?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Protecting, rather than thinking about what if something goes wrong, because that's the number one question that I think people get asked when they tell family and friends and co-workers that they're having a home birth.
Absolutely.
And it's really, I found it to be a really offensive question, because I haven't considered that. Rather than thinking about it in those terms, I guess it's more helpful to go, how can I protect my energy in the hospital environment if that has to happen, or if I choose for it to happen? Because, and not thinking of it necessarily as a failure either, because, you know, I don't have any hard and fast stats around home birth transfers, but anecdotally, I've heard that most home birth transfers are non-emergent. That's not an emergency situation. It is a, you know, maybe the mum just wants some pain relief, maybe she's tired, or it could be any number of reasons. And it doesn't mean that you've failed. So rather, thinking about it more in terms of, I just want to be prepared and make sure that I'm protecting my space in case that happens.
Yeah, look, absolutely. And I think, you know, when we listen to what women talk about in terms of what they do find distressing in those situations, really often what they talk about is actually a lack or a kind of loss of connection. Yeah, that you sort of, and again, particularly when we're talking about home birth, you're kind of in your bubble. Yeah, you've really carefully created this bubble at home with you and your people. And what that means is that part of what you're doing at home is what we call co-regulation. Yeah, so that you have this kind of energetic loop, if you want to think of it that way. Yeah, and we co-regulate each other. We keep each other calm and focused and centered. And people have usually chosen very carefully at home birth who is going to be in that bubble. And one of the things that they're thinking about is what will it be like to co-regulate with that person in my space? And women are really, really good at identifying when that starts to not feel okay anymore. Some, you know, classic story kind of, we transferred to hospital and this, you know, staff member came into the room and I just felt like they didn't get it and we weren't connected. They didn't know me, they didn't understand. And that's where things sort of start to unravel.
Yeah, totally. And you've just sort of made me think about how important that is for partners too, to be completely aware, because I mean, in my case, I feel like my partner and my mum did a good job at remaining calm for me. But I think that goes a lot to their nature, and my mum working in emergency departments, you know, she's very used to doing that. But if I didn't have them, if I had a partner who was, I don't know, a little bit anxious, I would totally pick up on that. So I guess it's really important to discuss this with your partner or support team or whoever you plan on being with your birth, particularly at the moment with COVID, because hospitals are still limiting the number of visitors that can come with a woman to hospital. So that's a real fear, I think, that home birthing mums might have at the moment, is that if they do have to transfer, their midwife might not be able to come with them. So I think definitely that warrants some thought and discussion about what you would do and how your other support people would advocate for you in that instance.
Absolutely. And once again, providing an opportunity to have those conversations about what do you think you might need? Yeah, in that circumstance, how are you going to how are you going to maintain that sense of connection
Yeah.
with your people, and how are you going to sort of, you know, transfer your bubble from home to the hospital, and what are you going to need when you get there, because your needs will be different in that setting.
Yeah, that's something I definitely put a lot of thought into for my second pregnancy, because I planned home birth again, and totally different mindset. So the first time I was really, really, you know, fully invested in, this was the only outcome that I would consider. The second time, my bubble, if you like, had been burst already, and I didn't want that to happen again. But I was also very aware that I needed to do some work, so that if I did have to transfer again, that it would not break me. You know, I was really, I went to saw a psychologist after the first birth and before the second pregnancy and throughout, because I really didn't want to feel that way again, that sort of taken blindsided feeling.
Yeah.
And so I did, it was uncomfortable. It was really uncomfortable to think about birthing in hospital, especially after that first experience. But I did it because, you know, I felt it was necessary for me anyway, at least for that sense of control. And so practical things like having a bag. I basically had my birth space set up at home and a mini version in a bag ready to go, because for me, that was a part of my visualization, you know, the aesthetics, the sounds, the smells, all of those things were important to me. I felt like they would ground me. So I had, you know, my playlist and my lights and my diffuser and all the things that all the physical things that I thought about when I pictured my ideal birth. But also those discussions. So, you know, I had the same midwife the whole way through. So she was very well aware of what I wanted and what I didn't want. But having those conversations with my husband as well, and making sure that he knew, like, this is an absolute no-go for me, or if they suggest this, these are some options that I would like to, you know, because there were times when I was in the hospital the first time where I couldn't speak, you know, because of the pain. I just couldn't speak. So I'm very aware that he couldn't read my mind, and I had to tell him all these things.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think there's a lot of different layers to that, you know, in terms of preparation, and it's a good idea for your support people to know what you want and what you don't want anyway. But yeah, I have heard from, I know many people who've had hospital transfers, and they've been really positive experiences purely because of their midwife and that continuity that they have and that trust in their care provider. I think that is the most important thing, you know, but also.
And when we look at the research around what women do actually find traumatic and or distressing at birth, what's really fascinating about it is it's not actually, very commonly, it's not about the event that occurred. It's actually about interpersonal relationships.
Yeah.
And so the vast majority, like sort of about 3/4 usually, of what women describe as being the source of the stress and or distress, which may then turn into trauma or not, it is to do with interpersonal interactions with care providers.
Yeah.
And that was brought home to me really strongly a couple of years ago in a project that I did with women who had experienced perineal suturing. So they had torn or had had an episiotomy and had then been stitched. And it was mostly in the hospital setting. There were a couple of home birth transfers in the group. But what was really, really clear and extremely fascinating to me in that project was that it wasn't, we weren't able to say, oh, well, if you have a 3rd degree tear, that's going to be traumatic for you. Because actually it wasn't about the event. It was about your experience of how you were treated during the event.
Yeah.
And, you know, they say that in the kind of trauma world, is that one of the ways that it's described that I really like is trauma isn't what happens. Trauma is what happens to you on the inside in response to what happens.
Yeah.
So the way I kind of think about that is trauma is not an event. Trauma is a response.
Yeah, yeah.
Something that happens in us rather than something consistent and identifiable that is external to us. And somehow I feel like that's an important message as well when we're thinking about this idea of having a, you know, whether we think of it as plan B or just sort of being flexible and fluid in our thought processes and the way in which we approach birth. Because as we know, birth is so multifactorial. There are so many contributing components to what happens during labour and birth. And it feels intuitively like that spending some time, you know, identifying what's okay and what's not okay for you before it happens is probably going to serve you well.
Yeah, yeah. And, you know, it's, like you said, it's not as though you don't have to put all your energy into it. You don't have to, you know, you can spend the majority of your energy, as they say, manifesting and building this network, the support network, the environment, you know, doing all the things that you feel you need to do to have a positive experience. But I feel like you know, it's one thing that my counsellor said to me is, if you get it out of your head and onto a page or have that discussion with the people around you early, you will not stress about it as much through the pregnancy. And it was totally right. I mean, I had my birth plan A, birth plan B, C and D ready very early in the 2nd pregnancy. And then, you know, I did have some fears and anxieties throughout the pregnancy because it was a VBAC and I got kind of fixated on those very rare, you know, because of what had happened to me before. And I felt like I needed to consider every single option and be prepared for them all. But it did actually reduce my anxiety to get these things out early so that I stopped. Well, I felt like, okay, that's done. It's on paper. I've spoken to my support team about it. They know what to do. And to be honest, in the labour itself, all those fears just melted away. It was really, really strange. But I know that because we live in a society where, you know, there is a lot of fear around birth in general, or there's this expectation that birth is meant to be painful or it's meant to be traumatic, and you know that what you see on the TV and in movies, and if you've never experienced birth yourself or seen somebody else give birth, you really don't know what to expect. And so even though you may be, you know, like I was, trying to filter out all the negative stories from other people, sometimes they do just take hold. So do you have any advice for people who have just any kinds of fear around birth and what they can do?
That's a big question, Kristyn. I think I am yet to meet a woman who doesn't have some fear around the idea of giving birth when they haven't experienced that before. You know, for a lot of us, it's about the uncertainty.
Yeah.
And even these questions that we're sort of, you know, starting to play around with today about how do we prepare, what is appropriate, will we jinx ourselves, if we allow ourselves to have, you know, negative thoughts or kind of hold in our minds the idea that things might go more than one way. So look, I think fear is a really tricky one, because again, it's about context. And I think we all bring our kind of whole self to the experience. And so we may already have processes in place that we know work for us to start to think about that kind of stuff. But as a general rule, what I think about in terms of fear is, again, sort of from a nervous system perspective. And basically it's a kind of, I think of it kind of as layering. Yeah, so like a fear is like just a tiny, thin, fine little layer, you know, but it's like an extra layer on what we're asking our nervous system to regulate for us. So the more fears that we have built up, the more layer upon layer upon layer we've got that we're unconsciously asking our nervous system to regulate for us. And so I'm a big believer in we try and expel as much of that fear as we possibly can. And that can be as silly or as serious as works for you. And sometimes it is literally like go and run around the trampoline in the backyard, waving your arms in the air and making a ridiculous noise, you know, get your other kids to do it with you, get your partner to do it. And that actually just allows us to release some of that energetic component that comes with holding and managing those fears.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think we often get into I don't even think it's particularly conscious, but just a kind of way of thinking and being with this stuff that it's like if we let the lid off, we get really worried that like all the fears will kind of fly up and we'll be sort of overwhelmed by them. And I guess what is important to say is that in my experience, that is actually not what happens. In my experience, what happens for women is that we're able to do that in a way. The kind of therapeutic term we use is titration, which is from science, and it means adding like one drop at a time of something to another thing. So it's literally like we just take it very slowly and gently, and we can actually just let some of those fears rise to the surface and then allow them to be worked through. And just, even if we can't let go of them, because I'm very mindful here, okay, of not putting women in a situation where we're saying to them, you have to resolve all of your shit before you're going to be able to have a good birth. Okay? that is A, not true, and B, just again another task for women to carry. Okay, you have to empower yourself, you have to have all of this knowledge, you know, and now we're going to tell you that you have to resolve all of your shit as well. You don't have to do that. But the more that we can let your nervous system have that experience of just being kind of loosened up, yeah, even when we think about it at a sensation, in a sensation, like fear is about tightness, fear is about holding. Yeah. So what we want to do is we just want to loosen it off a little bit, which is also great practice for labour, because it's exactly what you also need to do in labour.
Exactly, yeah. So things like, you know, your meditations that you may do, you know, your hypnobirthing or calm birth or whatever. I found things like acupuncture. Whenever I get acupuncture, I cry. It just all comes out.
Yes.
It's all, you know, chiropractic, all those, you know, there's lots of alternative therapies that can help, but exercise, like you said, you know, just moving your body and getting it out. So someone's just asked, are there other collective ideas you can help demystify? I know there is, there's one that I wanted to touch on a bit later, I guess, and that's this, it might touch on that question, but yeah, if there's anything specific that you wanted us to address, just pop it in the chat. For me, pain, I think, is a big one. And I found it, I think there's different types of people. There's some people who feel like looking at statistics and figures and things like that can make them you know, alleviate some of their fears. So there are some people who are heavy into the home birth research, and that makes them feel safer or more comfortable with their decision. For me, in my second pregnancy, I was quite anxious about pain, because having not gone into labor for my first, I was like, this is my first time all over again. So I found one of Rhea Dempsey's books particularly helpful for me, because she likened labor to any other kind of difficult physical event. And so I actually had on my you know, little birth affirmation flags in my birth space pictures of this day where I climbed this really big mountain, and it was really hard and it hurt, but I felt this sense of achievement at the end. And so I tried to think of birth in that way, that, you know, it is just another really, it's like running a marathon or something like that, you know, a challenging physical event, and that it's not pain in the sense of there's something wrong pain, it's functional, this is my body working pain, you know. And that was just me. I found that really, really helpful to kind of address or reduce that fear that I had. And, you know, there's always things that you will get from the outside, like your friends or family. You might come across, you know, a story. Like I stumbled across a story in a VBAC support group online that sent me into a bit of a spiral. So I think there are some practical things you can do to sort of protect your energy in that sense. Maybe remove yourself from some of those groups, turn the notifications off. You know, I found back then I was going to positive birth movement meetings, which they don't have anymore officially, but just surrounding yourself with, you know, people who believe in you and your ability to birth, and, you know, that sort of thing I found helpful. Yeah, I can't think of any other really collective ideas, I guess, around birth, but maybe they'll come up later in the discussion, I'm sure. Okay, so one thing that I did want to mention before, when you were talking about big T and little t trauma, is this, like, what is birth trauma? So I heard Hannah Dahlen say once that birth trauma is whatever the woman says it is. And I love that, because I feel like, and I know I did personally feel this way, that there's a bit of comparison that goes on. So people would say things to me like, at least you have a healthy baby, at least you're okay, at least, you know, this and that. And they were sort of dismissive, you know, but they did make me doubt that whether I felt was traumatic. And so, you know, eventually I came to learn that yes, it is, because I feel that it was. It's about what I felt, not what happened. And yeah, that it's a really personal thing, and comparing it to other people's trauma is it's yours, you know, it is what it is. And it also might just be that you're a little bit disappointed. You know, you may not feel that it's traumatic, but maybe something happened that you wish didn't happen, or you wished that it had gone this way. And I think that's totally normal too. Like I don't know anybody who has told me their birth story who didn't feel like things deviated slightly from their plan. You know, that's just how birth is. It's very unpredictable, but yeah, you know. Sorry, I've just been asked in the chat, could you answer, Athena, that question before as well, the one that I just answered?
The one about collective ideas. And that's from Valerie, is that right? Valerie, would you mind just popping into the chat just a couple of, just to clarify that a little bit? I'm just sitting with this thinking, collective ideas. Do you mean like kind of social ideas about what birth is, or kind of expectations on women? Is that the kind of stuff that you're thinking about? Just maybe just let us know a little bit, if you don't mind, please, just a little bit more clearly what it is that you'd like us to address there, and then we'll come to that when it pops up. Okay, thank you. Common fears, expectations, and ideas that you see people letting go of. Okay, yes, I can absolutely speak to this. Hello, perfectionism, number one. Okay, I speak to a lot of women who, and as Kristyn has just pointed out, it's not even necessarily that that sort of big T trauma has happened. But when we hold, and again, we're kind of back to this thinking about like rigid ideas versus fluid ideas. When we hold very rigid ideas and expectations of ourselves about what it looks like to have a good birth and how that compares to other people's births that we are seeing on Instagram, for instance, there's an enormous amount of pressure and expectation that women place on themselves. That's not because they want it. It's because there is this incredibly strong, so I'm really fascinated by this stuff, I have to say. There's this really strong social messaging that I feel has sort of emerged in the last, probably more so in the last 5 years, which I think is a kind of response to the fact that the hospital-based maternity care system does a very poor job of meeting women's needs during labour and birth. And that is not because midwives are not good at their jobs. There are an enormous amount of midwives in those systems who are working their guts out trying to provide good relational care to women, and they are prevented from doing so from the systemic issues within the maternity care system. So a shout out to all the midwives who are in there trying their best. But I think as a kind of, I don't want to use the word backlash, but as a kind of response to this growing, public knowledge that it's not that awesome in that system for women, we've kind of seen this shift of responsibility. And I worry sometimes. I wake up in the morning worrying about what we're saying to women about how responsible they are for generating their own sense of empowerment, for creating this kind of perfect birthing experience, which, as Kristyn's just been talking about, comparison is not helpful, but now with social media, it's actually inevitable that we are going to compare our experiences to others. And the level of perfectionism that women talk about, that they are bringing to that experience, for me, is unprecedented at the moment. It just seems to be creeping higher and higher. So there's a really common set of expectations around what a good birth looks like. And then if those expectations are not met, we have this subsequent feelings of shame, failure, deep regret. And of course, the thing about birth is that you don't ever get a do-over. You don't ever get to do it again. So when we think about, the things that we carry that we're sort of heavy-hearted about in our lives, almost all of them we may have, if we want it, the opportunity to re-engage with that stuff. Relationships can be repaired, family breakdowns can be put back together, but you can never go back and redo birth. And I think that's part of why there is such a heavy set of expectations on getting it right, which is where this sort of perfectionism comes from. We have to get it right.
Yeah.
That's a bit of a rant. Sorry, I hope that was okay. Let me know if that addresses your question, Valerie.
It's a good segue into what I wanted to quickly chat about next, is that in the home birth community, because there are so few of us who choose home birth in Australia, or rather not choose it, but are able to access it, that our community is fiercely protective of home birth and the reputation of home birth, and that sometimes, I mean, I can speak to my own experience. After my first planned home birth hospital transfer, I felt like I didn't belong in the home birth community because I didn't achieve my home birth through no fault of my own. But I know that there are some women who do blame themselves, you know, and that's, you know, I guess in a way I blamed myself for not being flexible with my plans, but I think it's a really sad but natural response that we experience. But not saying that it is anyone's fault, but I felt like I didn't belong. And that was all in my head. It was all my own internalized shame, I suppose, or guilt. I didn't actually feel unwelcome by the home birth community, but I didn't put myself out there anymore. I stayed away because I felt like I didn't belong. And it's really sad. And I reflect on that now, and I think about how awesome this community is, and how I know people who've never had children who are in the home birth community and really important members, and how much I could have benefited from that community in that time in my postnatal period, and also the pregnancy for my second child. So I thought that was something really important to talk about, because you know, if there are any others who feel the same way, like whether you have your baby in home or at hospital, if you're still a home birth mum. If you planned your home birth, if you would love to have a home birth one day, you're still a part of the community. And yeah, I hope that, I don't know, if there's anyone out there feeling the same way that I did, I hope that, you know, you will put yourself out there, because this community is so supportive and just special. But also I feel like even though birth trauma or birth disappointment is majority happens in the hospital setting, there will always be some in the home birth community who emerge from their birth feeling disappointed or sometimes traumatized about how it went. And it's a bit of a sensitive topic, because I feel like it's not a welcome conversation sometimes in the home birth community, because of our fierce protectiveness of home birth's reputation. And also I feel like, you know, judgment from family and friends as well. You know, the number one question you get asked when you announce that you're planning a home birth is, what if something goes wrong? You can do everything, you know, within your power to prevent that from happening. But if you do transfer to hospital for whatever reason, I felt personally that my family or you know, co-workers or whoever would blame my choice to birth at home for that. You know what I mean? And
Yes.
that may make some people feel even more silenced and more shameful about what happened, or less eager to talk about it because of that. Is that making sense? Yeah. I mean, do you experience much of that, or have you, being a home birth midwife as well, much of that kind of, I don't want to say suppression, but I can't think of another word, of that experience in the home birth setting?
Yeah, I think it's a really great thing to raise, and you're right. It's I also have the sense that it's quite a tricky piece of territory to be in. And you might remember Kristyn and I spoke to each other briefly a little while ago before coming together to do this today, and we spoke about this actually and whether it was appropriate to talk about it. And I said to Kristyn, even like I can feel it in me. I can feel the resistance rising up, just going, oh no, I don't want to have to talk about this. And it does come from that place. I think you're quite right. I think it comes from that place of there is a very fierce sense of protection of home birth, particularly for people who work in it or have experienced it. Or people who are aspiring, you know, and know how important it is to have that option available and, you know, try and make it more accessible for others. It's really tricky, but I do feel like, you know, home birth is still birth.
Yeah.
One of the beautiful things about home birth is that we know that some of the kind of really protective components, the kind of identifiable things that protect us from distress and stress around birth, are in place at home. And that's those things about control over your environment, connection to your caregivers, you know, having what we call agency. So understanding that if you want to act, your actions are going to have an impact. You're going to be seen, you're going to be heard, you've got continuity of care. So all of those things are really protective of the quality of birth experience that people have. But you're absolutely right. It's really important to point out, and not only when transfer occurs. Yeah, I think we do tend to focus on that as a kind of marker of whether your home birth was okay or not. But in fact, there are many things that can still occur at home birth that can leave people with some really difficult feelings. And I can speak to this myself. I actually also, my son's 23 now. So a long time ago, it feels like, was a planned home birth who transferred to hospital, did not have a great experience. But when I came out of that, actually, for me, it was my feelings toward my midwife, my home birth midwife, that I really struggled with for a long time. So, you know, there's work to do there then in that interpersonal and relational space if we feel let down by our care providers, or in any other way that we have been, you know, sort of compromised or, you know, had our boundaries transgressed by the people who are caring for us. So it's a really important conversation to have. Home birth is not actually, you know, it's not a magic pill. Yeah, we still experience our whole full spectrum of feelings at home birth in the same way that we do in other places. However, by choosing it, what we're doing is setting ourselves up so that we're more protected from most of the things that cause distress.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I had an episiotomy during my home birth, which I struggled with for a while because you know, that led to a managed third stage, and you know, those things that I you know, for a couple of months I felt like I didn't do it right because I didn't have that full. But again, it's when I think about it now, 3.5 years later, all I can remember is the empowerment and the safety and the love and everything, you know, that small part, and that doesn't matter as much anymore. And it really speaks to your, you know, when you talked about perfectionism before, that's the first thing I thought of. You know, I wanted my baby in the pool and I ended up having her outside of the pool and with an episiotomy. But really, the feeling, the sense of achievement that I had at the end wasn't diminished by those things.
Yeah, and I just want to quickly speak to, I know we're nearly out of time, but it just occurred to me as you were saying that when I talk about perfectionism, I feel like we often use perfectionism as an insult. You know, we talk about someone being a perfectionist. Oh, it's kind of this, has this really strong negative connotation, particularly amongst women, is my experience. I just want to say that when I'm talking about it, I am not using it in that way. So I'm not meaning to sit in judgment and be sort of looking at all of these women and going, "Pah, they're just perfectionists." It's actually, it's the feeling that women bring when they come into that space to investigate that stuff, and they often self-identify it, that the feeling is that they have to be perfect.
Yeah.
So I wanted to clarify that.
I sort of associate it with that societal expectation and those extra burdens that we put on ourselves, and maybe you know, I feel like there is a bit of a sense of that once you announce to the world that you're planning a home birth, that you have to get it right. And it ties in with that whole, you know, reputation of home birth, what people are going to think of you, all of that. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like each one of us as individuals becomes a kind of flag bearer for home birth.
Yeah, it's a big burden, and kind of ties into that question. Any tips for self-protection, deflecting social judgment about choosing home birth? I think this question comes up a lot in home birth Facebook groups.
Yeah.
And for me personally, the first time around, I tested the waters a bit with close family, and I didn't get the response that I wanted. There was some fear, and I can associate that now with a misunderstanding about what home birth is. They didn't understand, but I went into, I'm just going to keep this between our immediate family and not broadcast it to the world it was for my own protection almost.
Yeah.
So that's my advice to people is you don't have to shout it from the rooftops. Do what feels best for you. And for some people, that is, if they really, really feel like they need their mother-in-law or their auntie and uncle or whoever on board, getting them to chat to your midwife is a great start, because often, especially with partners, I mean, if your partner's not on board with it, that's a different story, and that's something that does need to be, addressed. But speaking to your midwife, we have plenty of these pre-recorded Q&A sessions with midwives, reading books. There's all sorts of things that you can, if they're willing to do it, introduce them to the information. So, or, get them to chat to someone else, chat to another home birth dad or another, there's lots of different ways you can address that social judgment. But as far as, outside of your immediate family, I don't feel like you really have any control. And, to be honest, you don't really have any control over your immediate family either. But I feel like, there's a little bit of, I don't know, what do you think, Athena? There's a little bit of just letting go of what society thinks about you and your choices as well, which is hard. It's hard.
It is. It's really hard, and particularly in the context that we've just identified, which is that, when you choose home birth, it is almost like you become a kind of flag bearer. You're a really sort of identifiable public hotspot almost. That people suddenly feel like they can say whatever they like to you about this. So it is important to consider self-protection. I think all of the things that Kristyn has suggested are really great. I also feel like there's something here about being able to speak to people from a place of kind of centeredness yourself. That you know that you're confident and you feel like you've made a good decision for yourself. One of the things that we talk about a lot is, and we say this in teaching as well, like people don't remember what you say, they remember how you made them feel. Mm-hmm. So if people engage with you and start to ask you difficult questions, the way in which you respond is part of the messaging that they take in. So the more kind of, I'm not suggesting you be completely blasé and offhand, but the more kind of relaxed and okay you feel about your own decision, the more actually that is conveyed to the people around you. And I also think Kristyn's absolutely right. Think very carefully about who needs to know. Who needs to know and why do they need to know? What do you owe them? What responsibility do you have to them?
Yeah, choose your battles, because I mean, typically I feel like I am the kind of person who has no fear of confrontation and standing up for myself. But when I was pregnant, I was a different person. I was very much in protection, cultivating this experience for myself. And I found it much easier for myself to just pretend. I just pretended that I was having my baby in hospital, which ended up being what happened. And so people didn't ask any questions of me afterwards. But that wasn't why I did it. I did it because I just didn't want to have that conversation with those people.
Yeah.
And I read a really, or it was a meme or a quote or something I saw. Don't accept criticism from people you wouldn't go to for advice. And so those people that I wouldn't go to for advice, I just didn't tell, because their opinion was not important to me. And I feel some people are different. Some people will fiercely, like, I'm a home birther and they're very proud of that. And I feel like that's what I was like the second time around. But the first time was very different. And you just got to go what feels right for you at the time,
Too. And when you're in those interpersonal interactions, the other thing that you can try is sort of flipping the script, so that if you've got someone who is expressing all of their worries and concerns to you, you can try actually just saying to them, oh, wow, you sound really worried about this. Do you want to talk to me about what it is that worries you? Because actually I'm not worried.
Yeah.
I'm okay. So how about we talk about what it is that's concerning you? If that's where your worry is coming from, perhaps I can address some of those things. Or, like organise a family screening of the birth time film. Just get everyone to pile over into the lounge room and eat a pizza and watch that. And that'll answer a lot of everyone's questions without you having to do any work.
Yeah, totally. And a lot of those questions come from that person's own previous experience.
Exactly.
And they are projecting that onto you when they ask those questions or say those things. Like, it's really easier said than done when you're the one receiving statements like, oh, I would have died if I had my baby at home. But you have to try, and I think it's helpful to try and remember that that's them projecting their fears and their experience onto you. They're not saying it to be hurtful towards you necessarily. Like they, especially with close family and things, because it can be offensive to be asked questions like, aren't you worried if something goes wrong? Because already when you're pregnant, you feel a bit of mum judgment and mum guilt. And I think, that's one thing that I kind of learned after the first one, is those statements are hurtful, but they're not intended to be hurtful. So, yeah.
There's a really nice suggestion that Jess has put into the chat here. And she says, I've asked people who have questioned me about my choice, would you rather pass away in hospital or at home? I feel the same about birth. I would prefer to be at home.
Yeah.
It's a really nice way of framing that. And again, a nice way of kind of flipping the script a little bit. Yeah. He says, let's make this about your feelings for a moment.
Yeah, exactly. And you don't need to go into every conversation armed with all the safety stats and all the justifications for your choice, because it's your choice. Other people's opinions don't really matter, but yeah, that's a really good way. Like, this is my preference for many different reasons. I just wanted to quickly share some resources. I know, Athena, you do counselling sessions with people who are, pregnant and postnatal. So can you just talk to us a little bit about those services that you offer?
That I personally offer? Oh, sure. Yeah, so it's pretty straightforward. It's counselling with a really strong focus on the phrase that I use is people who've been up close to birth. So that might be that you're pregnant and anticipating birth. It might actually be that you were previously pregnant and you had a pregnancy loss. It might be that you're working through issues of fertility and receiving some kind of treatment, sort of anything and everything that is wound up with the way that we feel about pregnancy, labour and birth. And also taking into account the fact that care providers come up close to birth. And one of the things I have said previously and will say again is that every time a woman has a traumatic birth, there is a midwife in the room, usually, who is also having a pretty shit time of it. Not always, but a lot of the time. And so, it's part of what's starting to almost like self-generate now, I personally feel like, in those settings, is that we have this kind of trauma upon trauma upon trauma. So yeah, I'm working with midwives, doulas, women across the kind of spectrum of childbearing, I guess I would describe it, and with a kind of emphasis on people's experiences within the maternity care setting. Because what I hear from women that I work with is that sometimes the kind of missing piece for women, and this is partly a kind of midwifery thing, it's partly a feminist thing, is that when they talk to psychologists and counsellors who don't have first-hand experience of the maternity care setting, it can be incredibly difficult to convey to people how, in particular, how power and control are enacted in that space. And as a practitioner, if you haven't been in that space, you often don't have a really great handle on it because it is extremely particular. Yeah. What happens in that maternity care setting is not like what happens in other healthcare settings. It's just not the same. So I guess, yeah, that's part of what I do, is try and come from that place with that really particular understanding of what those things look like and how the kind of far-reaching implications of that then play out in women's lives.
Yeah. Yeah, I found that, 6 years ago when I first saw my psychologist about that, is that she had experienced something similar, and I could relate, and she could relate, and that was, I found that really validating personally.
Yes, absolutely. And I would really suggest that anybody who is looking for counselling around this kind of stuff, seek that out, be very particular, and seek out someone who you really do feel like gets it.
Yeah. And I just wanted to quickly share some books that, because I know counselling is just not accessible for people for various reasons. This book here, How to Heal a Bad Birth, was amazing for me, and I recommend it all the time. It was the only place I saw, it's got a very small paragraph on home birth transfer, but also, from my experience, cesarean under general anaesthetic, which I feel is completely different to a normal cesarean, but it really helped me, this book, and also this one. And this one particularly is all about growth after, moving on. But yes, thank you so much, Athena, we've gone a little bit over, but that's fine. Thank you so much for your wisdom and setting aside the time to talk to us today. I'm just going to quickly share my screen so that everybody can scan the QR code. Just bear with me while I figure out how to do that. Okay. Because I need to show you the, sorry, just bear with me. The QR code for the $50 discount that you can scan. I should have had this up and ready. I thought I did actually. Hang on. My laptop is ancient, so it's opening, it's opening, it's opening. So everybody just take a photo or scan this voucher, and it will get you $50 off. Sorry, it's still up. Here we go. $50 off at Active Truth. So I'll leave that up for a couple of seconds. And if you missed out on this, all you have to do is join any of our other sessions that we have going on this week, and they will be showing it there. I hope everybody got something from this, and thanks for all your comments. And don't forget to buy raffle tickets to our, because there's some really good prizes. Thank you so much again, Athena, and everybody else.
Thanks, Kristyn. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Have a good afternoon.